Question number 12, Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order. I've called the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Defence. Does he stand by his response yesterday, quote, "Well, why would you," end quote, when asked if he would publicly release details regarding the level of protection afforded to New Zealand personnel in the upcoming deployment in Iraq?
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, in the context that the question was asked, yes.
Supplementary question. The
Mr. Speaker, when details about legal protection have not been suppressed in the past, is the lack of transparency in this case because, in fact, he's achieved less protection for our New Zealand soldiers in Iraq? If not, what is the reason?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, there is no suggestion, or it is an unreasonable suggestion from the person asking a question that there has been less legal protection achieved for our people who will be deployed to Iraq. But I would go on, sir, to suggest to him that he look back at recent history, 2001, 2003, 2006 and 2009, and note that such agreements were not released on those occasions. On at least one of those occasions, sir, I believe he was the Minister of Defence.
Order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Phil Goff.
I seek leave from the House to table the Status of Forces agreement in regard to the Solomon Islands in 2003, and in fact the Foreign Affairs and Defence Select Committee report that went...
The document's been described. It doesn't need further description. I'll put the leave sought to table that particular document. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled.
Supplementary
question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to transparency, why did his office yesterday mislead journalists by telling them that New Zealand soldiers were not in Australia training for deployment, only to correct that later in the day after it was exposed by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation?
Because he doesn't know what's going on. Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, the member is using his own interpretation of circumstances to create a picture that is simply untrue. I was asked about the issue at around about 9:45 yesterday morning, and I confirmed to them that there were troops training in Australia. The really ironic thing, sir, here is that the Labor Party think it's odd that our troops should train for a mission before they go. Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to table a document showing that it was the Solomon Islands government that passed special legislation in 2003 that enabled the arrangement to be put in place that Mr. Goff speaks of.
Order.
It was not the New Zealand government.
Order. The document's been described. I'll put the leave. Order. Would both Mr. Brownlee and Mr. Mark continue their conversation after question time? Order. Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is none. Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Why has Mr. Brownlee refused to be transparent when asked and tell this House what the level of risk is in the area that we are deploying New Zealand troops to, when the Australian government, by comparison, has been open about the fact that it's high risk, and when the New Zealand Chief of Defence Force, General Keating, told the Select Committee that the place we're going to is an extremely dangerous place, quote unquote?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr. Speaker, once again, the member asking the question puts together an assertion and suggests that it is fact. It's not. I have always maintained that we need to exercise a high degree of caution in the way in which we engage around this particular deployment, because it is risky, and anyone who watches their television on an evening will know that.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Phil Goff.
Why has the Minister repeatedly failed to be open, honest and transparent around the questions of legal protection for our deployed troops, around risk levels for the Iraq deployment, and even about our soldiers training for deployment in Australia, when answering honestly any of those questions does not involve any security risk for our people?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm actually quite surprised that you allowed that question, given the fact that it was
plenty of licence
full
for the
of
answer.
all sorts of accusations manufactured in the mind of Phil Goff. I've always been open about the nature of this particular involvement, but I have said that there are particular concerns around this deployment that will mean that we do not say some things publicly. And if the member can't work it out, I'd suggest he spends a little bit of time with some of the families who've got members who'll be part of this deployment. Of course, for his own political reasons, he doesn't care about that. He's got no interest in protecting those people. He's only got an interest in trying to get a little bit of public position that might put him back into contention against his old mate Andrew Little here.
Order! The general debate will start shortly. Point of order. Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave.
Order. Point of order will be heard in silence.
I seek leave of the House to table the United States Status of Forces Agreement with Iraq, which is available on the internet.
Well, if it's available on the internet, I won't be putting the leave. That concludes questions for oral answer. Would some honourable member care to move that the House take note of miscellaneous business? The honourable